Afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this session on the second day of the Cambridge at Home experience. We've got another fantastic day of talks and sessions lined up for you today. My name is Matt Elman. I'm the Professional Learning and Development Manager at Cambridge University Press, and I'll be moderating this session along with my colleague Eve Richmond. And our speakers today are both from our sister organisation, Cambridge Assessment. So we're delighted to be joined by Donya Estafanous and Sarah Ellis, both working as assessment support managers in Europe. Donya based in Cambridge, Sarah based in Bologna. Is that right, Sarah?
Yes, that's right. And so good morning and thank you to everyone for joining us. And thanks very much, Matt, for the introduction.
Great. So we'll be here for about 45 minutes. There'll be a chance to ask Donya and Sarah your questions during the session. So if you could put those questions in the Q&A box, please. Could I ask you not to ask about certificates or recordings or slides in the Q&A box? Certificates will be shared at the end of the session and we'll also email those to you. If you're asking about recordings, then they will also be shared, but you can find them on YouTube at the moment. And we're also streaming this session live to Facebook. So welcome to anybody joining through Facebook. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Donya, who's going to kick us off. Thanks, Donya.
Thanks very much, Matt. Yeah, as Sarah said, thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you for inviting us to be part of this event. We're really delighted to be able to be here and speak to everybody. So welcome everybody and thanks for joining us wherever you are in the world. Good morning, Sarah. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And good morning to everyone. It was nice to see so many people joining from different parts of the world. So it's good afternoon and good evening. I saw some people have got up in the middle of the night. So thank you particularly for doing that.
That's real dedication.
Yes.
So Sarah and I are going to be talking to you today about engaging and motivating your students through visible progress. So just to give you an overview of what we mean by that, we're going to be looking at, first of all, the importance of visible progress. So we're going to be looking briefly at what it is and why that's important. And then, of course, we're going to be giving you some principles to help your students see their progress. And once we've talked about some principles and strategies, we're going to, of course, give you some practical ideas that you can take with you and use in your classroom to help students learn how to see their progress. And as Matt said at the beginning, there will be some time at the end for questions and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. Okay?
Great.
So let's get started. So to begin with, we're going to start by looking at why visible progress is important.
And to start with it, as the title of the presentation mentions, we're thinking about engagement. So we wanted to start with this question, which is to actually ask you when your students are most engaged. So we would like you to write some of your ideas in the chat there. We've got one here as an example. So when they can relate to the material, perhaps the material is of interest to them and that the task is interesting as well. What other things do you consider you see when your students are most engaged? We've got visuals, we've got when it's fun and when it's on topic, that's interesting. It's going very fast. When the task is interesting, when they're playing, that's interesting. When it's practical, when it's visual, and perhaps there's a competition or competitive element. There's some great ideas here in the chat. When it's related to their experience and when it's meaningful, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Lots of good ideas there.
That's great. When it's digital, that's also interesting, especially at the moment. When it's related to exams, somebody said. When they're using Kahoot, that's a great tool. Some people are mentioning tools as well. When they can show commitment, wow. Great. Thank you for those contributions.
Okay, so here are some points that we've come up with. I think you've probably covered in the chat box a lot of our ideas as well. So we have suitably challenging. So of course, we don't want classes to be too difficult because that can be quite off-putting for students, but also if they're too easy, then students might, lose interest and not feel as engaged if they're not challenged. Okay, are given a say or a choice. So this could be in the materials used in the class. So if we encourage students to bring their own materials, perhaps reading texts or listenings, things that they're interested, things that they've had a part in choosing, that can be motivating, which can help to engage students in learning. All right. Understand the purpose of what they're doing in class. So of course, if students know what they're doing and they know why they're doing it, they're much more likely to engage with it. If we give them a gap fill of grammar exercises and say, do this, and there's no reason for it, probably not the most engaging thing to give to students, particularly teenagers who might not see the bigger picture of why that exercise is going to help them in the long term. Very good. And do we have any more? So are aware of how they are progressing. So this point we've put last because this is of course what we're going to be focusing on today, is ensuring that students are aware of how they are progressing. So we're going to be looking at how that can also mean that students are more engaged. So how can progress feed engagement? How can progress feed engagement? Have a look at this picture here of the trees. We have, obviously it can take years and years and years to grow a tree. And if you look at that tree every day, you probably won't see much change. You won't see much growth or development. But if you don't see it for a year or two and come back to it over longer periods of time, you'll see that development. And actually the same can kind of apply in our language classroom. Learning a language, again, is a lifelong process. It can take years. It does take years. And sometimes seeing that progression and seeing that development can take a long time. So by being aware of progress can motivate and empower students to carry on. And it does develop a sense of competence, because if students are aware of how they're doing on a shorter term, it can help them continue and power through the more challenging times. Those of us who have been language learners or learners of anything, it's quite normal to have periods where you feel as though you're really progressing and doing really well, and that's really encouraging. And then there might be some times where you feel that you're not doing so well and, oh, what's the point? Maybe I should give up, or maybe I should try a different way of doing this. So by being aware of your progress on a regular basis will help you get through those times where you might feel that you're not doing as well as you could be. So it's really important to constantly be aware of how you're doing in order to ensure that you'll stick at it and that you're engaged and you're motivated to carry on. Okay, so we've talked briefly about why making progress visible to students is important and some of the benefits of that. But how can we do this in the classroom? How can we as teachers help our students see their progress?
Well, of course, one of the ways that we can do that is actually to set really clear objectives and aims. And of course, exams can be a good way to do that, because of course you have very clear objectives and a clear pathway. And these could be formal exams like the Cambridge English qualifications that you can see here on the screen. And of course, each one has a clear focus. And I like the idea of the steps because, of course, it's about developing, moving from one step to the next. And the student can see that what they learn on one step, they take with them to the next step. So again, it kind of gives that visual image. And I think the tree, the idea of growing and the idea of going up a step, of course, gives a visual image to that progress. And I think many students respond to that. I'm very visual myself. And to have something that I can see where I'm going and how I'm moving up that pathway is very, very useful. And I think, you know, this is just one image we can use in that learning journey.
That's right. It's a very clear image of that progress through the levels. But even with those levels, students might be studying for a year or longer than a year within each exam to get to the next one. So within that time, how can we help students see that they're progressing within each level?
And of course, at the end of each level, they'll get a certificate. And of course, that's a very visual demonstration of the progress that they've made.
And very satisfying to have that tangible piece of paper to show that they've got to the next level. But within each level, what can we do? So we're going to have a look at some different strategies in order to help our students see their progress on a more regular basis. Okay, so these strategies include setting measurable objectives. So we'll be looking at objectives throughout the year and looking at more shorter term objectives at maybe termly or in the lessons. We're going to be looking at exit tickets, which is a way of having students reflect on how they've been doing in each lesson. We're going to be looking at pre and post task checks. So the idea of doing tasks more than once and reflecting on progress. And of course, we're going to be looking at providing meaningful feedback, how we as teachers can ensure that we're giving students the information and the feedback that they need to move forward and to improve. Part of that feedback is looking at peer feedback. So it's taking the teacher away and involving students more. So we're going to be looking at some benefits of this and ideas of how we can do this. And then finally, we'll be looking at the idea of student portfolios. So looking at how students can really keep track of everything they've done, how they can record and store the work that they've done and use that to reflect on their progress and see how far they've come and how well they're doing. So the first one that we're going to be looking at is setting measurable objectives. So what do we mean by measurable objectives? So the idea of having a measurable objective is students know what it is they're aiming for. So as Sarah mentioned, in exams, this can be perhaps quite clear to students. They've got a very clear goal. They need to get that certificate. They have example exam tasks. They know what they need to aim for. They know what they need to do. And with help from their teacher, they can know how to get there. However, for students who aren't maybe studying for an exam, this might be less obvious. So it's important that within the year, perhaps every term or at the start of the course, the teacher sets out the objectives for their students so that they can know what they're going to be learning and know what they are aiming towards. So how can we do this? So this is one example. You probably recognize this, all of you that teach using course books. So this is a page at the beginning of a course book that sets out the different units as well as the different skills and language that students will need to study within that unit. So we've got here, for example, reading and use of English, the listening skills, writing tasks that they're going to do, speaking, grammar, vocabulary, and even some real life skills. So it's really broad. So a nice activity is make time in your class at the start of your course to have students look at this page and focus on the units that you'll be covering in that course or in that term. And give them some questions to consider, perhaps which of these topics do they know information about? Which of the topics are they looking forward to learn about? Which of the topics do they feel that might be difficult for them more than others? And then as well, looking at the skills. So for the first unit, it says writing a story. Do you know about writing a story? Have you done this before? What are you looking forward to? What do you think you might find challenging? And get them to discuss it with their peers and get them really familiar with what they're aiming for within that course. So at the end of the term, once you've studied those units, you can then give them the same questions to reflect on and see, how have you done? How do you feel about these topics now? How do you feel about these language skills? Do you feel that you have progressed? Hopefully the answer is yes. And another thing that can help students see their progress and how they've progressed in these units is by showing them the end of unit progress test, which lots of course books have. And again, you can show this to them at the beginning and say, if you were to do this test, how would you feel having to do this now, today, on day one of your course? It's likely that they'll feel intimidated and that they won't be able to do it very well. And you can assure them that at the end of the course, they will be able to do that. They'll be able to do it confidently, and they should feel much happier with how far they've come. So that's looking at termly objectives or course objectives. But that can still feel quite long term, especially to younger learners, to teenagers, where they might not always be looking so far ahead. So as well as termly objectives, it's a good idea to have objectives every lesson. So at the start of the lesson, do tell your learners what it is they're learning, what it is you're going to be covering in that lesson. And it's important that these objectives aren't just grammar or vocabulary or reading skills. It's important that they are in a context. So here, for example, students are going to read and understand an article about how life is different now for teenagers compared to the past. So they're really getting a sense, an understanding of what they're going to be doing, and they can see how it's relevant to them. It's about teenagers, it's about looking at time. It's not just using the meta language, which might go over their heads. They're also going to talk to their classmates, give opinions about life in the past, okay? So they're very clear objectives. They know what they're going to be doing in that lesson. Okay, so I mentioned that you wouldn't just list the skills that they're going to be studying. You need to put it in a context. However, it is important for students to also be aware of those skills that they're learning. If you ask a teenager at the end of the class, what did you do today? Maybe their parents will ask them. Looking at these objectives, they might say, oh, I read an article, I talked to my friends. Okay, that's great, but what skills did you learn? What language did you learn? It's really important for us to point out to students all those skills that they have used to be able to complete that task successfully. So here I have all of the skills and the language that students would need to use in a lesson to fulfill these objectives. in the chat box, can you guess what the missing words are? In the chat box, can you guess what these missing words are? What are the skills and the language that students have had to use, had to develop in the lesson to complete these objectives?
I can see we've got some really quick answers there. They're
Can
doing
you
really
see?
well. Vocabulary.
Aha, reading for gist, okay.
Grammar. Right, then somebody's been more specific, exactly, using the past, simple.
Great. Scanning, key language, good. What else can we see?
Skimming.
Extensive reading, yeah, possibly if it's a long article. Good. Opinions, right.
Everyday vocabulary.
Adverbial expressions. Responding to questions. Okay. Using targets. Okay, let's have a look if you were right. So we have vocabulary relating to general life. Very good. Reading for gist. So you might ask your students to look at the article and pick out some of the main points. They might do it very quickly, look at the pictures, look at the heading. So it's pointing out to students, why are we doing that? What's the skill there? What are you learning? What skills are you developing? And then specific details. So you might give them some more specific questions to look for in the article in order to help their comprehension. The past tense, so lots of you quite rightly said that if they're going to talk to their classmates about life in the past, they're probably going to have to use the past tense, and the article is making comparisons about life now and in the past, so they need to be able to recognize that and also use it productively. And comparative language, so looking at differences as well as opinions. And as you rightly said, responding appropriately. So it's not just about giving a monologue, giving your opinions. It's about, can you listen to your fellow classmates? Can you understand what they're saying? And can you give an appropriate response? So there really is quite a long list of skills and language that students have used in this lesson in order to be able to fulfill these objectives. And it's really important to point this out to students. You haven't just read an article, you haven't just had an opinion, you've developed all these skills and you've used all of this language, and that's really wonderful, okay? So really praise them for that and show them what they've achieved in their lesson. And you could do this by eliciting from them what skills and language they've needed to use to fulfill these objectives, or you could give it to them and get them to match them up to the activities that they've done and really get them to reflect on the skills that they've used. Again, giving them a sense of progress, a sense of what they've achieved in that lesson to help them engage and see how well they're doing and how far they've come.
And an extension to that, what Donya's been saying, is actually to encourage them to reflect at the end of the lesson. And one way to do that, of course, is to use an exit ticket. And an exit ticket basically encourages students to reflect on that learning at the end of the lesson, as Donya was saying. And if you like, it gets them to process the concepts that they've been looking at, perhaps to express in their own words the learning that they have done, and as fundamentally to be more aware of that progress that they're making towards those objectives. So I think that the exit tickets can encourage students to summarize the lesson, to look at those key points, to analyze critically, and to refine their own knowledge and learning by actually revisiting it at this stage in the lesson. And of course, this is getting them also to think about what they've done well, and perhaps to plan ahead, to think about what they'd like to do to perhaps feel more confident about. So it's also looking at what they've done well, but also looking at what they'd like to do next, and perhaps to revisit, to strengthen the work that they need to cover. So it helps them to be more confident, and it means that they're actually not just looking at a list of meta language in their course book, as Donya was saying, but actually living it and actually applying it, which I think is really good. Now, there's different ways that you can do exit tickets. One way, of course, is to write some questions on the whiteboard. Whether if you're online, you can write it on the whiteboard on your platform if you have one. You might give out a handout if you're in a normal classroom, but you can also use tools to do this, and we've got some examples here. On the next slide, which I don't know if you know Socrates. Some of you may have used Socrates. Perhaps you'd like to write in the chat if you're using Socrates, but it's one of my favorite tools. It's a free tool, and you can log in as a teacher, and as a teacher you can create quizzes. So let's have a look at the next slide, and you can see that you can actually choose the kind of questions that you want to use. Now, when you log in as a teacher, it creates what they call a room, and you can see my room is called Ellis 3636, and I've chosen exit tickets. Now, the exit tickets are there for you, and you can choose this as an option, or you can actually create your own, but I like this one because it does it for me. You could see here that you can write the name of the students, and the names of the students will appear on a list underneath the class total, or just before the class total, and you can see when they've answered the questions. Now, these questions are already prepared for you. So if we look at the next slide, you can see what they're like, and this is the teacher view. So the teacher can see the question and the options that the students can choose. The students will log in to my room, Ellis 3636, and they will see these questions appear, and they will choose the most suitable answer for themselves. The first one is just a quick, how well did you understand today's material? And they will say from totally to not very well, and they can feel free about expressing that. And then they can do a short answer in the next question. What did you learn? So again, this is that reflection process, so they can decide what they feel they've learned in the lesson, and they can write a short answer. And in the third question, the option says, please answer the teacher's question. Now, I can orally set that question. So what do you think you need to do in the next lesson, for example? And the student can write their answer in that. Now, the teacher will be able to see the student's answers, and the teacher can decide whether they want to share the class answers or not. They can also decide if they want to show the students' names, or keep them hidden. So there's lots and lots of options, and it's really easy to use. It's free, and I always say, if I can use it, it must be easy. But it's a really useful tool. If you don't want to use Socrates, of course, if you're using Google Classroom, or even if you're not, you can use a Google form. And Google form allows you to create questions, a bit like Socrates. And if we can see some examples here, you can choose to create an exit ticket of your own. I've made my question, what 3 things are you taking away from the lesson? So I have different options of the kinds of questions that I can use in the exit ticket. So there are lots of other apps, but these 2 might be a good place to start if you're not already doing exit tickets. So you can see there.
So we've looked at a way to end the lesson and reflect on what's happened in the lesson. Now we're going to have a look at another strategy, which is pre and post task check. So teachers are probably familiar with the idea of a diagnostic test, where you might give students a test or a task at the beginning of a lesson or the beginning of term to see how well your students can do a task, to see where their level's at, and to see where they might need support. So this can be a really useful way for teachers to assess where their students are at the moment. But quite often this is more useful for teachers than it is for students. Students might have a grade or a score, but how can we make that idea useful for students? So one way is through a pre and post task check. So I'm going to show you here, this is a writing task from B1 Preliminary for Schools, but you can do this activity with any task at all. So the idea would be to give this task to your students and don't give them any support. Tell them to read it, try to work out what they have to do and complete the task. So no input from the teacher at all. So once students have completed their task, what do you think they need to do afterwards? What are they going to do next? They're going to reflect on how they felt and how they did in that task. So here I've got an example for you. We've made a little grid. So these statements have been created by looking at the assessment criteria of this task. So in an exam, students would be assessed on the content, on the organisation, on the language that they've used to do that task successfully. So we've changed these and asked students how confident they felt knowing what to write. So relating to the content, how confident they felt in the range of vocabulary, the grammatical structures that they needed, in understanding how to lay out their work, and were they able to use a good amount of linking words to join their ideas? How did they feel about completing that task? So once they've had time to reflect on that, at this point, the teacher would give their students input into the lesson, into how to do that task well. So the teacher input might include analysing the task. What do students have to do? It might include looking at the context to ensure that they're going to use appropriate language, the correct formality. It might be looking at different vocabulary that students could include. It might look at how students can state their preferences, because that's required for this task. And your lesson might include, again, input on how to give reasons, so how to extend sentences and give reasons for your ideas. So once this input has taken place, the next stage would be for students to do the task again. So they repeat the same task that they've done already, but this time they've had input from the teacher. And what do you think comes next? What's the final stage? They've done the task, they've reflected, they've had some input, they've done the task again, and the final stage is, it's reflection. Okay, so again, in this case, we're giving students the same questions to reflect on. And hopefully this time their answers will be different. They'll feel much more confident the second time. Now, I think it's important to note here that we haven't included a stage here that involves the teacher marking the work, okay? Because this is all about the students' perception and their confidence and how they felt doing the task, and looking at how they feel they have progressed, okay? So it's not about looking at the accuracy and the teacher giving feedback. And also note here, I've decided to do it on a piece of paper. You could do it as a poll. You could use a tool like Mentimeter to ask students how they felt, and that would be quite a quick way to get their feedback. But we've decided here to give them a table because it's very visual. It's something that students can keep and have a record of. And I think the crucial thing here to note is that they've done the same survey table twice, so they can have those next to each other and they can compare the differences and look at where they feel more confident, where perhaps they feel they need to work a bit more, where they might need more support from the teacher. Okay, so this could be on a Google Doc that you send your students. If it's a face-to-face classroom, it could be a physical piece of paper, something that they can keep. Would you like to add anything there, Sarah?
Well, I was going to say that you've been talking about repeating a writing task. And of course, that principle of repetition is really very useful in sense of giving a visual sense of progression. And you can extend that also by using, again, if we go back to look at Socrates, we can see how the teacher can choose different kinds of quizzes, and they can do multiple choice, true and false, short answers, for example. But one of the good things about this, of course, is that you can give the test again. And if we see on the next slide, you can see how you can vary the delivery of that test so that it feels different, but it is actually assessing the same thing. So here's an example from B1 preliminary vocabulary. I created the test. It's really simple. So you can choose the type of question type that you want to use. So here we've got multiple choice. I've input the data, and then of course I can allow the students to do the test with the answers or without the answers visible. And if you look at the next part there, you can, if you just click that for me, you can see how the teacher can choose how they deliver those questions. So they can let the student have immediate feedback, or they could ask the students to wait for that feedback until the end of the test. But you can also see on the right-hand side that you can actually shuffle the questions and shuffle the answers. So you could use the same test again. And so again, this idea of comparison, how did they do the first time? How did they do the second time? But the questions are not in the same order, so they still have to do a bit more thinking about it. And of course, what's good from the teacher's point of view is the test is saved and you don't have to write it again. You can just reuse it. So it's really useful as a tool.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have looked at how students can reflect on their own work. Now let's look at shifting that focus to the teacher. Okay, so obviously teachers need to be giving their students feedback on how they're doing, perhaps on specifics of language. And I think it's worth noting the word feedback implies looking back. What's happened, what's been done, what have you done in the past? But actually the feedback that we give needs to drive learning forwards. Okay, so all the feedback that we're giving to our students needs to help them, needs to be constructive in order for them to get better in the future. Okay, so it's about looking forward. How can students get better? So with that in mind, can you give us some ideas in the chat box? What would you give your students feedback on so that it's meaningful? Can you give us some ideas? What might you give feedback on to your students? Going to give you one as an example. So this is perhaps maybe not just a mark or a score. How can it be more meaningful than a mark or a score? Can you see some answers in the chat box, Sarah?
I can see some coming out. So we've got some interesting positive feedback. Was being said, positive comments, speaking about possible changes, looking at accuracy and pronunciation for speaking, praising attempts. That's very
very nice.
Timely.
Yeah.
Making sure it's useful, timely. Creative feedback. That's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, very nice idea.
3 comments and a wish.
Oh, that's a very nice idea, isn't it?
Formative feedback, somebody said there.
Okay.
Emoticons.
Oh, I like that, thinking outside the box. So actually, these do fit in with everything you've just mentioned. So it's looking at content and responding to what students are saying rather than just focusing on accuracy. That's very important. Talking about the active performance, just how they're doing, how their efforts, as somebody mentioned in the chat box. And yes, constructive feedback. I love that idea of a wish, something to add to the future content. I think that's a really nice idea.
And that's very much about what you were saying about forward looking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is great.
And pointing out strengths. What have students done well? What, how far have they come up to now?
And that's perhaps one of the challenges, is how can teachers do that? And I was thinking, when we were talking before, we were speaking a lot about writing and speaking as challenging for teachers to actually be able to show that progress. So we had a few ideas on that. So looking at speaking as an example. So for in B1 preliminary for schools, in the speaking test, students are asked to talk about a photo. And here we've just got some points that might help them talk about that photo. So we've got some ideas that will help them structure how they speak. So we've got describe, place. Can you show that list, Donya?
Sorry, yeah.
That's okay. So you've got the different, this is the prompts that can help them structure their answer, give them ideas of what to say. And of course, the important thing is that online, one of the things that students can do is perhaps to simply record themselves on their phone, or using an app like Flipgrid. I particularly like Flipgrid because you can actually ask your students to upload a picture and then record themselves describing it. So that's another free tool that you can use, and then they can re-record themselves and perhaps decide which one is the best before they send it to their teacher. So using either their phone or something like Flipgrid. There are lots of apps, but those are just to mention two. And if they do it several times and then send it to the teacher can listen to it and then send feedback. Also, audio feedback. It's perhaps a quick way to do it, and it means that the students can listen to that individual personalized feedback. The teacher can use the same list of prompts to make their comments, and of course that means the students can listen to it more than once and keep it as a record of their progression. So this tool, Voice Spice, is again another free one, very easy to use, and so a teacher can record it and send it very simply to their student to listen to. I don't know, I really like that. There are others as well. Now, of course, if we move on to writing, there are other things that you can do giving audio feedback on writing. And a teacher I work with has kindly given me a sample of her work and her feedback that she gives to students. And notice how she has highlighted some of the words in color. She's used a kind of color code, and then she speaks to the student personally and gives them the feedback. And I think we can just play a tiny little bit so you can see how she's motivating the student to look at the work and revisit it and make some kind of progression. So if we can, have we just got to see if it works?
First of all, let's just look at the things I've highlighted here in yellow. We've got a repetition of really here 5 times in the piece. So I think that you can find another adverb that will create more variety in the piece. Also, we've got the word something repeated 3 times right at the center.
So that's just a little example, but you can see that of course the student has a record, and again they can go back to it, listen to it again, and also if they're doing it regularly they can actually see how they've progressed. They've got a very visible record of that progression. Now if we go on to thinking about from teacher feedback to peer feedback, because I think an important part of the process of seeing your progression is also thinking about how peer feedback can help students see their progress. I'm not sure if you can see the next slide. I think you might have frozen. Donya?
Can you see? It says peer feedback and it has 3 points.
Okay.
Can you see those?
Not at the moment, but the
We can't see
okay.
that, Donya. If you just stop sharing the presentation and then reshare it, that might help us.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just while we're thinking about that, so talking about peer feedback can help progress feel very visible. And I think that the benefits of peer feedback are actually quite amazing, because when you have to, when you have to give feedback to your peer, you actually, if you like, have to internalize the success criteria, so that when you're giving that feedback to somebody else, you've thought about the criteria. And what we can see is that students understand the criteria better because they're telling their peers about it. But when they do their own work, their own attempt at the same task will actually improve, because they've done that peer feedback. It's really quite a powerful tool. And if teachers help students to learn how to give feedback, they will see their own progress as a result as well.
Can you see that now, Sarah?
Yes, that's great. Thank you, Donya. That's super. I'm with it. So, so assessing feedback, and if we can look at the next slide, we've got an example of a writing task. Now, I think that we need to stage this giving peer feedback by first making sure that the student is confident about the task themselves. And here's an example of some self-study material that you'll be able to download. This is new material available for teachers. And this helps a student think about the writing task that they have to do. They will also look at commenting on an anonymous piece of work. So they look at the criteria, they give them that feedback to the anonymous student and get some help in this task. And then the next stage, of course, is having looked at that, been through that process, of course, is then to move on to giving peer feedback to somebody else. That may be something the teacher can set up, where a student is studying alone. Perhaps they might have a study buddy, but certainly teachers can encourage students to offer peer feedback. And as I said, it really does make a difference to how they internalize the criteria and then activate it in their own work.
Okay, so of course, if you want your students to assess each other's work, they need to know what to assess them on. Otherwise, the comments might be quite general. You might just get, yeah, it was good, it was okay. Or quite often you find that peers can be a lot more critical than actually the teacher when they're assessing their peers' work. So it's very important to give them some guidance on what to look for. So here is a checklist that you would give your students before they do their piece of writing. So it acts as a checklist. So answer the question, what do you have to do? Who are you writing to? Thinking about the register, looking at how many ideas and how many paragraphs to include. Okay, so this is what students would use when they're doing their writing. And then when they are assessing their peers, they would use those same questions. Okay, so they're comparing how well their peers answered those questions and followed that checklist that their teacher gave them. So in this case, we've given them a rating, so they can rate them from 5 down to 1 and decide how they've done in those different categories. And again, these categories mirror what students are assessed in, in the exam. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what's happened there. So in this example, it was numbers. However, you can choose to
to give some kind of verbal feedback as well, or
Exactly,
written
Sarah.
feedback. And
Exactly.
if they're working collaboratively, having had the framework from their teacher, they might actually display it on something like Padlet. Padlet allows the students, of course, to share and collaborate on the work. Here we have some students' essays, and underneath each essay, there's actually peer feedback. And one of the benefits of actually displaying your work, of course, is that you're thinking about the audience, and you're also actively involved in the process. Now, this is obviously a group effort, but students can also use Padlet to keep their work individually, and you can have 3 free Padlets, by the way, so they could choose to actually use it to keep their own writing separately as well, and have a record, a visible record of their progress. And I think that actually leads into talking about portfolios.
That was a perfect lead in, Sarah. Thank you. So very quickly, we've mentioned the importance of tracking progress for students to see their progress. And one way that they can do that is to keep a portfolio. So for any voice recordings that they've done or that their teachers have for them, they can keep in one place. It could be a digital folder on Padlet, as Sarah suggested, or it could be on paper, or it could be a combination of both, somewhere that students can keep a record of all the work they've done and all the progress that they've made, that they can look back and reflect on. So we'd recommend that within your class time, you actually plan in time for students to be able to review and reflect on the work that they've completed and on their progress, because it is a really important part of their learning. So try to include it in your class time, and over time students will start to do it on their own without you prompting them. It will become automatic and help them, encourage them to look for areas of improvement and what they need to work on. So
here we are, we've got to the
here
end.
we are. So to summarize, we can't stress the importance of helping students see their progress, helping them maintain engaged in learning English, and this can be done by involving students, okay, by encouraging them to reflect on a really regular basis, and always remember to point out to students how far they've come. Keep them going, keep them engaged, keep them wanting more.
Thank you so much, Donya and Sarah. What a fabulous session. We have just a couple of minutes for questions, but before we dive into those, just to remind you that the link for certificates is appearing in the chat box now. If you miss it, don't worry, because you'll still be able to download your certificate via the email that we send out later on. A recording of this session will be made available on YouTube, so you can enjoy it again later if there's anything that you missed or that you want to go back to. And we're not going to be sharing the slides, unfortunately, but you have that recording as a reference point. Donya and Sarah, we're going to rattle through these because we don't have too much time, but a couple of questions that came in. Lots of people asking which of the techniques you've outlined here would be suitable for young learners, for primary learners. What could you do in the primary classroom?
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of these can be adapted in the primary classroom, but just depending on how you do it. So the reflection task that we showed you with the statements, where students have to comment on how confident they feel, you can replace the numbers with smiley faces and make the language more simple and relevant to what you'd be teaching your young learners in the lesson. I think it's really important to start that reflection process in young learners. I think the younger that they start, the more natural and it's going to become as they get older.
And you'll actually be able to find some progress charts to download on our website for specifically for young learners, with that kind of statement that Donya's just mentioned.
And one more thing to mention, I think, is for your learning objectives, a nice thing for young learners to use is can-do statements. So you can present them some can-do statements very simply for them to look at and then reflect on.
That's great. And I think just one more question, since we're short of time. some of the teachers attending obviously have large classes, or they have many classes, and they're asking how much of this would work when you're trying to deal with many students.
Well, I think one of the benefits of peer feedback is actually when you're in a large classroom, that gives more opportunity, because one of the problems for a teacher is that you can't give enough feedback to when you've got a large class. So by involving students, then there are more opportunities for everybody to get that just a little bit more feedback. And I think it can be a very positive experience. And as I said, students will really internalize the criteria better and be able to then use it in their own work.
That's
Absolutely.
a great point.
And I think as well, by giving students a checklist before they attempt their writing or their speaking, and them using that to reflect after they've attempted the task, means you're giving them quite clear and structured criteria and guidance. So actually the teacher probably won't need to monitor quite so much. So that can work really well in large classes.
That's great. I think we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. I think there's you've probably got a thank you slide there, Donya, maybe. But thank you everyone for attending. Great to see so many of you here. Do join us in about half an hour for the next session, which is with Cambridge trainer Alan Davenport. Highly recommend that one. Yeah, keep enjoying the event. Thank you very much again to Donya and Sarah.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye from us.
Bye from us. Bye.